The night I met Jonathan, I was honestly just trying to get through another boring Friday at that dive bar downtown. My friend had ditched me for some guy she'd been texting, and I was about ready to call it a night when this decent-looking guy approached my table. He wasn't my usual type, a little too clean-cut, a little too eager, but there was something sweet about how nervous he seemed. His buddy had apparently dragged him out after some bad breakup, and he kept apologizing for bothering me, like I was doing him some huge favor by letting him buy me a drink. Jonathan was different from the guys I usually dated. He actually listened when I talked, remembered little details about my job and my friends, and didn't immediately try to get me into bed on the first date. It was refreshing. Honestly, we went to concerts together, took these spontaneous weekend trips to the coast, and he even introduced me to his mother after just a few months. She absolutely adored me, which wasn't surprising. I've always been good with parents. I knew how to be charming, how to ask the right questions about family photos, and compliment her cooking. Those first few months were pretty perfect. If I'm being honest, Jonathan was attentive without being clingy, successful enough to take me to nice restaurants, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in his world. He texted me good morning every day, bring me coffee when I had early meetings, and genuinely seemed interested in everything I had to say. It was the kind of relationship that looked amazing on social media. All those cute couple photos and weekend adventure posts that made other people comment about how lucky we were. But by the time we hit our 1-year mark in 2020, things started feeling a little too comfortable. Jonathan had settled into this routine where he'd come over after work. We'd watch Netflix, maybe order takeout, and he'd be perfectly content with that same boring cycle every single night. He stopped planning surprises, stopped trying to impress me, and honestly started taking me for granted. I found myself getting irritated by little things. The way he'd pause his video games to analyze my moods, how he'd want to discuss our relationship every time I seemed quiet, the predictable way he'd suggest the same 3 restaurants whenever we did go out. That's when I started working more closely with Joel on some projects at the office. Dr. Joel Martinez was everything Jonathan wasn't: sophisticated, well-traveled, intellectually stimulating. He'd lived in Europe, spoke 3 languages, and could actually hold a conversation about books, art, politics, things that mattered. When Joel suggested we grab coffee to discuss this article we'd both read about sustainable architecture, I thought, why the hell not? I'm a grown woman. I can have male friends. Jonathan doesn't own me. And frankly, it felt amazing to talk to someone who didn't treat every conversation like a relationship check-in. Joel was married. Sure, but he was also clearly unhappy. He'd mentioned how his wife didn't understand his work, how they'd grown apart since having kids, how he felt trapped in this suburban life that was slowly suffocating his creativity. I could relate to feeling trapped. Honestly, Jonathan had this way of making me feel guilty for wanting more excitement, more intellectual stimulation, more passion in my life. With Joel, I felt appreciated for my mind, not just tolerated for my presence. Our coffee meetings started happening more frequently, and I'll admit there was chemistry there. Joel would text me articles he thought I'd find interesting, ask my opinion on work decisions, treat me like an equal partner in conversation rather than some fragile thing that needed constant emotional maintenance. When Jonathan would ask about my day, I'd mention running errands or staying late at the office, not technically lies, just simplified versions of the truth. I wasn't doing anything wrong by enjoying intelligent conversation with a colleague. The first time Joel kissed me was after one of our evening coffee sessions had turned into dinner. We'd been talking for hours about this documentary on urban planning, and there was this moment when he looked at me and said I was the most intellectually curious person he'd met in years. It felt incredible to be seen that way, to be valued for something beyond just being someone's girlfriend. When he leaned across the table and kissed me, it felt like waking up after months of sleepwalking through my relationship with Jonathan. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand, Jonathan and I had fallen into this completely passionless routine. He'd gotten comfortable, stopped trying to seduce me, stopped making me feel desired. With Joel, every conversation felt like foreplay. He'd send me these thoughtful texts throughout the day, remember details from conversations we'd had weeks earlier, and look at me like I was this fascinating mystery he couldn't wait to solve. The physical part of our relationship developed naturally from there. Joel would book us hotel rooms during lunch breaks, and those hours felt more alive than entire weekends with Jonathan. Joel appreciated things about my body that Jonathan had stopped noticing, wanted me to express myself in ways that Jonathan found too intense or complicated. I started taking photos for Joel, sending him voice messages when I couldn't sleep, creating this whole intimate world that existed just between us. Meanwhile, Jonathan was becoming increasingly paranoid about my phone habits. I'd flip it over during dinner because honestly, I deserved some privacy. and he'd get this wounded look like I was personally attacking him. When he'd ask why I seemed distant or tired, I'd explain that work was stressful and I needed space to decompress. Any normal person would understand that. But Jonathan would turn it into this whole thing about our communication patterns and whether we were growing apart. "You've been getting a lot of work calls lately," he'd say, like he was some kind of detective instead of just my boyfriend. "And you seem to be running errands every weekend now." The way he said it was so accusatory, so controlling. I'd tell him he was being insecure, that I needed him to trust me to manage my own schedule without providing a detailed itinerary of every moment we weren't together. His neediness was honestly becoming exhausting. Joel, on the other hand, respected my independence. He never questioned where I'd been or demanded explanations for my time. We'd meet at this little hotel near his office, and he'd have wine waiting, candles lit, music playing, the kind of romantic effort that Jonathan had stopped making months ago. Joel would spend hours just touching me, talking to me, making me feel like the most desirable woman alive. He'd take photos of us together, record little videos of me laughing, create these beautiful memories that proved how much he cherished our time together. I started telling Jonathan I was too tired for sex most nights, which wasn't really a lie. I was exhausted from living this double life, from managing two completely different relationships, but also after experiencing the kind of passion Joel brought out in me. Jonathan's predictable approach felt boring and mechanical. Joel would text me at midnight just to tell me he was thinking about me, while Jonathan would roll over and assume I'd be available whenever he felt like it. By late summer, I was practically living for my time with Joel. He'd book us weekend getaways when he could, claiming work conferences or family obligations to his wife. I'd tell Jonathan I was visiting friends or needed solo time to recharge, which again, wasn't technically lying. I did need time away from his constant emotional demands. Joel and I would spend entire afternoons in bed, talking about books, planning hypothetical trips we'd take together, imagining what our life could look like if circumstances were different. The night everything changed started like any other evening. I'd been texting with Joel while Jonathan played his video games, making plans for the following weekend when Joel's wife would be visiting her sister. I went to take a shower, leaving my phone on the nightstand like I always did, never thinking Jonathan would actually violate my privacy by going through my personal messages. I mean, what kind of person does that? What kind of relationship survives when one person is literally spying on the other? I was in the shower, probably humming some song Joel had introduced me to, when Jonathan was apparently reading through months of my private conversations. Not just the recent texts, but everything. Photos I'd sent, voice messages, intimate conversations that were never meant for anyone else's eyes. The violation of that, the complete breach of trust, still makes me sick to think about. By the time I got out of the shower, Jonathan was sitting on the bed with my phone in his hands, looking like someone had died. "We need to talk," he said, and the way he said it was so dramatic, so accusatory. I'm standing there in my towel, water still dripping from my hair, and he's acting like he's caught me committing some federal crime instead of just having private conversations with a friend. I sat down on the bed, trying to stay calm while he worked himself up into whatever confrontation he was planning. He started reading my texts out loud, which was honestly one of the cruelest things anyone's ever done to me. Taking these beautiful, intimate moments between Joel and me and twisting them into something ugly and shameful. Jonathan's voice got colder with every message he read, like he was building a case against me instead of trying to understand how we'd gotten to this point in our relationship. "So this has been going on for months," he said, scrolling through my phone like he owned it. "All those work meetings, all those errands, all those nights you were too tired to even talk to me." The bitterness in his voice was unbelievable. Here I was, trying to figure out how to explain the complexity of my feelings, how to help him understand that this wasn't about hurting him, and he was already deciding I was some kind of monster. I tried to explain that things between us had become complicated, that I'd been feeling disconnected from him for months, that Joel had helped me remember parts of myself that I'd lost in our relationship. But Jonathan wasn't interested in understanding my perspective. He just kept reading more texts, getting more angry, building up this narrative where I was the villain and he was the innocent victim. "You sent him photos?" Jonathan said. "Like that was the most shocking thing in the world. You told him things you've never told me. You did things with him that you always said you weren't comfortable doing." His voice was shaking, and I could see him working himself up into this self-righteous fury that honestly scared me a little. I told him that people grow and change, that my relationship with Joel had helped me explore sides of myself that I'd never felt safe expressing before. But Jonathan took that as some kind of personal attack, like I was saying he'd held me back or something. He couldn't understand that sometimes you meet someone who brings out different parts of your personality, who makes you feel free to be more adventurous and open, The worst part was when he found the voice messages I'd sent Joel late at night when I couldn't sleep. These were deeply personal recordings where I'd talked about my dreams, my fears, my hopes for the future. Hearing them played back in that context, with Jonathan's angry commentary, felt like having my soul dissected in front of a hostile audience. So while I was lying next to you, thinking everything was fine, you were recording love letters for another man, Jonathan said. The way he said another man was so dismissive, so reductive. Joel wasn't just another man. He was someone who understood me, who appreciated my complexity, who didn't try to shrink me down into some simple girlfriend role. I tried to make Jonathan understand that I'd never meant to hurt him, that my feelings for Joel had developed naturally over time, that these things happen when people grow in different directions. But he was so focused on the timeline, on the specific details of what I'd done, and when, like he was preparing for some kind of trial instead of trying to save our relationship. That night, Jonathan told me he needed space to think, which I respected even though it felt like punishment for being honest about my feelings. I stayed at my friend's place for a few days, giving him time to process everything and hopefully gain some perspective on how we'd both contributed to the problems in our relationship. I thought maybe some distance would help him realize that people make mistakes, that relationships can survive difficult periods if both people are willing to work on things. But instead of using that time for self-reflection, Jonathan apparently decided to become some kind of private investigator. I had no idea he was digging deeper into my private life, contacting people, gathering evidence like he was building a legal case against me. The level of calculation and planning that went into what happened next still shocks me. A couple weeks later, Jonathan called and asked if I wanted to have dinner for his birthday. His voice was calm, almost friendly, and I thought maybe he'd realize that throwing away 2 years over some text messages was insane. I was hopeful that we could finally have an adult conversation about where our relationship had gone wrong and how we might fix things. I spent hours getting ready for that dinner, choosing the perfect dress, doing my makeup carefully, wanting to remind him of all the reasons he'd fallen in love with me in the first place. I even bought him a thoughtful birthday gift, this book by an author we'd both mentioned liking, inscribed with a message about second chances and new beginnings. The restaurant he'd chosen was this upscale place downtown that we'd been to for special occasions. When I arrived, I was surprised to see that he'd invited several of our mutual friends, people I hadn't spoken to since the whole situation had exploded. But I figured maybe he wanted witnesses to our reconciliation, people who could see us working through our problems like mature adults. Everyone seemed a little tense when I sat down, but I attributed that to the awkwardness of the situation. I mean, our friends knew we'd been having problems, so obviously they'd be wondering whether we were getting back together or officially breaking up. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking about their jobs and relationships, complimenting the wives on their outfits, being the charming, social person everyone had always liked about me. Jonathan was quiet during most of the dinner, but I thought he was just processing his emotions, or maybe planning some romantic gesture for dessert. When the main courses were cleared away, he stood up with this strange smile on his face and said he had something special for me, something that really summed up the last few months of our relationship. That's when he started handing out these manila envelopes to everyone at the table. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening, but it was too late to stop it. Jonathan had printed out screenshots of my text conversations with Joel, photos I'd sent, even transcripts of some of my voice messages. Everything that had been private between Joel and me was suddenly being distributed like some kind of sick party favor. I figured everyone should get a copy, Jonathan announced, his voice carrying this cold satisfaction that I had never heard before. That way, there's no confusion about who Brianna's been spending her time with these past few months. The way he said my name, like it tasted bitter in his mouth, made me want to disappear into the floor. I watched our friends' faces as they opened their envelopes and started reading through my most intimate conversations. The shock, the judgment, the way they looked at me like I was some stranger they'd never seen before. It was the most humiliating moment of my entire life. These were people who'd known me for years, who'd celebrated birthdays and holidays with me, and suddenly I could see them rewriting every memory to fit this new narrative of who they thought I was. This is insane, I managed to say, my voice shaking with rage and embarrassment. You're actually insane if you think this is an appropriate way to handle our relationship problems. But Jonathan just sat there with this satisfied expression, like he'd finally gotten the revenge he'd been planning all along. I grabbed my purse and stood up, trying to maintain some dignity, while everyone at the table stared at me with these disgusted expressions. Happy birthday? I said to Jonathan, putting as much venom into those words as I could manage. Then I walked out of that restaurant with my head high, even though I felt like my entire world was collapsing around me. The next few days were a nightmare of blocked phone numbers and ignored messages. I tried calling Jonathan dozens of times, wanting to explain that what he'd done was cruel and disproportionate, that public humiliation wasn't the answer to private relationship problems. But he'd apparently decided that cutting off all communication was somehow the mature response to our situation. Even worse, I found out through mutual friends that Jonathan had somehow gotten hold of Joel's personal information and contacted his wife with the same evidence he'd shared at dinner. Within a week, Joel's entire marriage was falling apart. His wife was filing for divorce, and he was blaming me for ruining his family. The man who'd spent months telling me how unhappy he was in his marriage suddenly decided I was a homewrecker who'd seduced him away from his perfect life. The unfairness of that still makes me angry. Joel was a grown man who made his own choices about our relationship. He pursued me just as much as I pursued him, told me he was already planning to leave his wife, made me believe we had a real future together. But when everything came out, suddenly I was this evil temptress who destroyed an innocent family, while he was just another victim of my manipulation. I tried reaching out to Jonathan through friends, through social media, even through his mother, who'd always liked me. But apparently he convinced everyone that I was some kind of sociopath who couldn't be trusted around their relationships. People who'd known me for years started treating me like I had some contagious disease that might infect their own marriages. About a month after the birthday disaster, I swallowed my pride and wrote Jonathan a long letter explaining how sorry I was for hurting him, how much I missed what we'd had together, how willing I was to work on rebuilding trust between us. I told him that I'd ended things with Joel completely, that I was ready to focus entirely on our relationship if he'd give me another chance. His response was brutal in its simplicity. Nothing. No acknowledgement that he'd received my letter. No explanation of why he couldn't even consider forgiveness. No recognition of the 2 years we'd spent building a life together. Just complete, total silence. Like I'd never existed in his world at all. By Christmas, I was desperate enough to send him a text message telling him how much I missed him, how ending our relationship was the biggest mistake of my life, how I'd cut things off with Joel completely and was ready to start fresh. I poured my heart out in that message, admitting that I'd made terrible choices, but emphasizing how much I'd learned from the experience. Again, nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. No sign that he'd even read what I'd written. It was like trying to communicate with a ghost, except this ghost was actively choosing to ignore me rather than being unable to respond. Almost a year later, I tried one last time through Facebook, sending him a message about how I still thought about him and wished we could start over fresh, how I'd grown as a person and learned from my mistakes. I told him that I understood why he'd been angry, but that holding grudges for this long wasn't healthy for either of us. That message was read but never answered, which somehow felt worse than being blocked completely. At least being blocked would have been a clear boundary. Being ignored felt like being erased. Like our entire relationship had meant so little to him that he couldn't even be bothered to tell me to go away. Looking back on the whole situation now, I can see that Jonathan and I probably weren't compatible in the long run anyway. We wanted different things from life, had different approaches to handling conflict, different ideas about what relationships should look like. Maybe the situation with Joel just exposed problems that were already there, issues that would have surfaced eventually, even without the complications of my friendship with Joel. The way Jonathan handled everything, though, the calculated revenge, the public humiliation, the complete refusal to even consider working through our problems, showed me a side of him that I'd never seen before. The man I thought I loved turned out to be capable of destroying me for sport. And honestly, I'm probably better off finding out what kind of person he really is before I wasted any more years on someone so vindictive. These days, I'm in a completely different place in my life. New job, new apartment, new perspective on what I want from relationships. I've learned to be more careful about mixing friendship and romance, more aware of how my actions might be misinterpreted by insecure partners. I'm dating someone now who's secure enough in himself that he doesn't need to monitor my phone or question my friendships. Someone who trusts me to manage my own social life without providing detailed reports on every conversation I have. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Jonathan had just talked to me like an adult instead of planning that elaborate revenge scheme. Maybe we could have worked through our problems. Maybe we could have found a way to rebuild trust and move forward together. But his choice to humiliate me publicly instead of addressing our issues privately showed me exactly what kind of person he was underneath all that nice guy bullshit. I'm honestly grateful now that everything happened the way it did. Better to learn someone's true character during a crisis than to waste decades with someone who turns vindictive the moment things get complicated. Jonathan did me a favor by showing me his real face, even if his methods were cruel and unnecessary. I deserve someone who fights for our relationship instead of fighting to destroy me. Someone who sees problems as things to solve together, rather than weapons to use against me.